Our research into this Babylonian tablet is going to change all of that. Plimpton 322 is a 3,700-year-old fragment of clay from the Old Babylonian period, and it's a scientific marvel of the ancient world. We've known for decades that its unusual sequence of numbers...
Imagine a clay tablet, buried for nearly 4 millennia beneath the dust of Babylon.
Holding a tablet that was written thousands of years ago and being able to read what it says, it's an amazing...
For centuries, its strange wedge-shaped marks mocked every scholar who tried to understand them. Then, in our own digital age, artificial intelligence stepped in, and what it revealed was not a dry list of grain rations or taxes. Instead, the tablet spoke with an unsettling voice across time, delivering a message no one was prepared to hear. Thanks to AI, another ancient mystery is unfolding: the tablet that refused to stay silent. Let's begin the imagery by picturing a slab of clay, small enough to fit in your hands, yet heavy with age and mystery. Its surface is etched with neat rows of wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform script, the oldest writing system humanity ever devised. But time has not been kind. The edges are chipped, the lines cracked, as though the tablet itself resisted the centuries it was forced to endure underground. When archaeologists first pulled it from the soil, they knew it wasn't just another fragment of Babylon's sprawling archives. Something about its detail, the density of symbols pressed into the clay, suggested importance. Imagine being one of those early excavators, brushing away layers of dirt, trying to make out the ghostly shapes under sunlight that hadn't touched them in 3,700 years. The thought alone is enough to send a shiver down your spine. And yet, for all its promise, the tablet refused to reveal its secret. Scholars squinted over it, compared its markings to dictionaries of known signs, even tried to reconstruct the missing bits where the clay had broken away. But the more they studied it, the less sense it seemed to make. It wasn't like other tablets, those dusty receipts for barley, those royal decrees, those star maps and omens. This one seemed to belong to a different category entirely. So, like many ancient puzzles, it was filed away, catalogued, shelved. The world moved on while the tablet gathered more years of silence. Researchers occasionally returned to it, much like you might return to an unsolvable riddle at the back of your mind, hoping fresh eyes would bring clarity. But it remained stubborn, a relic that seemed determined to hold on to its mystery. What's fascinating is how much humanity has invested in breaking these silences. For decades, deciphering a tablet meant long hours hunched over reference books, comparing symbols, double-checking translations. It was a painstaking craft, one that relied on patience more than speed. And even with all that dedication, some texts never gave up their meaning. They simply sat there, mute, haunting, waiting. That's exactly what this Babylonian tablet became, a haunting reminder that not everything from the ancient world is eager to explain itself. But here's the thing about history: it has a funny way of resurfacing when you least expect it. And some artifacts don't stay quiet forever. But to really understand why this stubborn slab matters, we have to step back into the world that created it, where kings ruled by divine right. The stars were read like maps, and a single clay tablet could hold the weight of an empire's secrets. A world of gods, kings, and secrets. Step into Babylon, 3.5 millennia ago. The air is hot, heavy with dust, and filled with the chatter of merchants hawking spices, grains, and precious stones. Towering walls loom over the city, carved with images of lions and dragons meant to ward off invaders. And somewhere within this bustling hub, scribes are hunched over damp slabs of clay, pressing stylus into the surface, recording the heartbeat of their civilization in rows of tiny wedge-shaped signs. For Babylonians, writing wasn't just a tool for bureaucracy, it was a lifeline. These tablets carried everything: trade agreements, marriage contracts, religious hymns, even ominous warnings from the gods. To live in Babylon was to exist under the constant gaze of divine forces. Every eclipse, every strange star in the night sky was interpreted as a sign. Kings consulted priests not only for political advice, but for reassurance that the heavens were on their side. This was a world where the supernatural and the practical were inseparable. If the harvest failed, the gods were displeased. If enemies approached, omens would have foretold it. And scribes, those quiet figures bending over clay, were more than record keepers. They were mediators between the human and the divine, entrusted to capture knowledge that could shape the destiny of a kingdom. Life itself was a delicate balance. At one end stood the grandeur of ziggurats, temple towers that reached toward the sky like stairways for the gods. At the other end, ordinary citizens crowded the streets, bartering for bread, tending livestock, trying to appease rulers who claimed divine authority. Within that contrast, tablets were everywhere. They were receipts of survival, testaments of faith, and instruments of power all at once. To hold a Babylonian tablet was to hold a fragment of a civilization obsessed with permanence. Kings wanted their victories immortalized, priests wanted their prophecies recorded, and merchants wanted their debts remembered. Every scratch of the stylus was an attempt to outlast time itself. And in a way, it worked, because here we are, thousands of years later, still straining to hear their voices through the clay. Now, imagine being a Babylonian scribe working on the tablet we're talking about. It wasn't just busy work. The marks you pressed into the clay could secure a kingdom, calm a restless god, or preserve a vision of the stars for future generations. Each line was deliberate, each wedge a piece of a code meant to endure. And yet, even in all this order and ritual, mysteries remained. Some tablets were simple, lists of sheep, jars of beer, tallies of bricks. But others, like the one unearthed after 3,700 years, were something else entirely. Something layered, enigmatic, and possibly dangerous if read the wrong way. Because in Babylon, secrets weren't always written for everyone. Some knowledge was meant to be hidden, protected, or even disguised. And every so often, a tablet comes along that reminds us just how much of that world remains buried, waiting for the right moment to be heard again. And that moment finally arrived, not through the hands of another weary scribe or scholar, but through the unblinking logic of modern artificial intelligence, the code-breaker of the future. For centuries, human eyes struggled with those strange wedge marks. Some signs looked familiar, others didn't fit any pattern scholars knew. It was as if the tablet had been written in a dialect no one alive could quite grasp. Then, almost unexpectedly, a new kind of translator entered the picture, not flesh and blood, but lines of code. Artificial intelligence, trained on thousands upon thousands of cuneiform inscriptions, approached the tablet differently. Where human scholars might hesitate, second-guessing the context of a phrase, AI simply devoured data. It compared, calculated, and searched for patterns across entire libraries of ancient writing in seconds. What a single researcher might wrestle with for years, the algorithm could process before you'd finished a cup of coffee. But this wasn't just brute force speed, it was perspective. AI didn't come with biases about what Babylonian tablets should say. It wasn't expecting a royal decree, a trade receipt, or a star chart. It simply looked for probabilities, for connections between symbols, for the hidden structure within the lines. And in that neutrality lay its advantage. Picture the moment. Researchers load the digital scan of the tablet, every crack and groove captured in meticulous detail. The algorithm begins its quiet work, reshaping fragments of clay into legible signs, assembling the puzzle one piece at a time. Hours pass. Lines of possible translations begin to appear on the screen. The researchers lean closer. They're not reading the same half-formed words they've seen for decades. No, this is different. Whole sentences are emerging, coherent, startling. The AI had not only filled in missing gaps where the tablet was damaged, but it also suggested meanings that human translators had overlooked. Imagine that thrill, that unsettling realization. A silent artifact had finally decided to speak, but through the voice of a machine. It wasn't a scholar gently brushing clay with a paintbrush. It was an algorithm, unblinking, efficient, pulling order out of chaos. And when the final translation scrolled across the screen, it wasn't what anyone expected, not at all. Because what the AI uncovered wasn't just another administrative record, it was something far stranger, something that felt less like bookkeeping and more like a message waiting nearly 4,000 years to be read. The decoded message and the twist. When the translation finally took shape, the researchers braced themselves for something mundane. Most tablets, after all, were the stuff of everyday survival. Records of grain shipments, contracts, or lists of livestock. Useful to historians, yes, but hardly earth-shattering. But as the words appeared, line by line, it became clear this was no shopping list. The tablet's voice was haunting. Instead of tallying goods, it spoke of warnings, cryptic, poetic, almost prophetic in tone. It mentioned cities rising and crumbling, kings losing power to forces beyond their control, floods sweeping across lands, and people wandering in search of food. One phrase, repeated like a refrain, chilled the researchers most. The one who forgets will suffer again. This wasn't the kind of text anyone expected from Babylon. It didn't read like a decree or an omen scribbled for a single king. It read like something bigger, like a reminder or even a plea, meant for anyone who might one day find it. Even stranger was its style. Babylonian tablets were usually straightforward, their language functional, but this one carried rhythm, almost like verse. The AI noted repeated structures, deliberate phrasing, the cadence of a message designed to be remembered. Was it a poem, a prayer, a warning disguised as literature? Scholars debated, but one thing was certain. The tablet wasn't concerned with the bookkeeping of its age, it was speaking across time. And in that moment, the room grew heavier. Imagine staring at a glowing translation on a screen, realizing that the words you're reading were pressed into clay by a scribe nearly 4,000 years ago, words that no human had fully understood until now. It almost felt like eavesdropping on history, except the message didn't sound entirely ancient. Parts of it felt disturbingly familiar, almost modern, as though the concerns of Babylon had looped forward into our own age. That realization hit harder than the translation itself. Maybe the ancients weren't simply recording their world. Maybe they were trying to reach ours. But how do you even begin to interpret something like this? Was it a prophecy, a metaphor, or are we simply reading our fears into their words? That's where the debate begins. Lost in translation or ancient foresight? The moment the translation was revealed, arguments broke out almost immediately. Some scholars leaned back in their chairs, shaking their heads, unconvinced. Others leaned forward, eyes wide, insisting that the words carried a deeper meaning. The beauty and frustration of ancient texts is that they don't come with instruction manuals. They're riddles, and how we interpret them says as much about us as it does about the past. One camp insists the message is metaphorical. Ancient Babylonians often spoke in grand imagery. Floods could symbolize political upheaval. Wandering could hint at exile, and forgetting might have meant neglecting rituals or turning away from the gods. To them, the tablet was simply a reminder for the people of its time. Honor tradition, respect the divine, and stability will follow. Seen this way, the text is no prophecy at all, but a cultural survival guide. Another group isn't so sure. To them, the words ring with eerie familiarity. Cities falling, rulers undone, people displaced. Doesn't that sound like the headlines of today? They argue the tablet might have been recording cycles the Babylonians observed. Empires rise, empires fall, and human arrogance almost always invites disaster. In this reading, the text isn't a local warning, it's a pattern, one the scribe believed would repeat long after his world was gone. Then there's the most daring interpretation, that it was meant for us. What if the refrain, "The one who forgets will suffer again," wasn't just about Babylonian ritual or politics, but about the danger of neglecting memory itself? In other words, the scribe could have been warning that when humanity forgets the lessons of the past, we're doomed to repeat them. And here we are, thousands of years later, still wrestling with war, famine, and collapsing societies. Of course, skeptics caution against reading too much into it. After all, humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We love to find ourselves in ancient words, to imagine they saw us coming. Maybe the text really was just an exaggerated sermon meant to keep people in line. Maybe the only prophecy it ever intended was to remind Babylonians that kings are mortal, gods are fickle, and crops fail if you don't respect the land. But isn't it strange, almost unsettling, that a text buried for 3,700 years can sound so uncannily relevant to today? Whether prophecy or poetry, metaphor or foresight, the effect is the same. It makes us pause. It forces us to look at our own world through the eyes of a civilization long gone, and to wonder if we're stumbling through the same cycles they warned about. The Babylonian era, humanity's first great experiment. Step back almost 4,000 years and imagine standing on the banks of the Euphrates River. The air is thick with the smell of wet clay and smoke from cooking fires. Towering walls rise in the distance, etched with images of lions and mythical beasts. Beyond them sprawls Babylon, the beating heart of Mesopotamia, a city so legendary that even after its fall, its name still echoes through history. To talk about Babylon isn't just to talk about a single city. It's to talk about an era, one of the first true experiments in what it means to be human on a massive scale. Civilization, in the way we know it today, was being tested there. Laws, science, art, religion, architecture, power. Babylon wasn't perfect, but it was a place where human ambition collided with divine imagination, where ordinary lives were shaped by extraordinary ideas. One of Babylon's most enduring gifts to the world came in the form of law. King Hammurabi, who ruled around 1750 BCE, etched his famous code into stone for all to see. Imagine being a farmer, merchant, or craftsman, and realizing that justice no longer depended solely on the whims of a ruler or the influence of the powerful. Hammurabi's code may feel harsh by today's standards. An eye for an eye is no gentle philosophy, but in its time it was revolutionary. It was the promise that rules applied to everyone, from noble to commoner. That simple idea that laws could govern society instead of chaos or cruelty still forms the backbone of justice systems around the world. But Babylon wasn't only about rules, it was about wonder. The Babylonians looked up at the sky and saw more than just stars. They saw patterns, omens, rhythms that they carefully recorded on clay tablets. In their hands, astronomy and astrology were born. While today we separate science from superstition, in Babylon they were twins. To track the heavens was both to understand the gods and to predict earthly events. That marriage of observation and meaning gave humanity one of its earliest sciences, setting the stage for everything from calendars to navigation. And then there were the ziggurats, those massive, layered temple towers that seemed to scrape the heavens. The most famous of all, the fabled Tower of Babel, may well have been inspired by Babylon's grandeur. To the Babylonians, ziggurats weren't just buildings, they were bridges between heaven and earth. Climbing one meant ascending closer to the gods, offering prayers that might sway fate. Even now, their silhouette haunts our imagination, echoed in skyscrapers and cathedrals, monuments to our endless desire to reach upward. Culturally, Babylon was a melting pot long before the term existed. Merchants brought goods and ideas from as far as India, Egypt, and Anatolia. Languages mixed, religions collided, and art flourished. Clay tablets preserve myths that still ripple through storytelling today. Legends of floods, divine battles, and heroic journeys. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though predating Babylon, was copied, preserved, and passed down through Babylonian scribes, influencing later epics, even the stories found in biblical texts. In a way, every time we tell a tale of a hero confronting mortality, we're echoing Babylon. Economically, the city was a marvel. At its height, Babylon was a hub of trade, its markets alive with spices, textiles, metals, and livestock. Silver served as currency, contracts were etched into clay, and an early sense of financial order emerged. Debt, interest, and credit, things we sometimes curse today, were concepts the Babylonians pioneered. They laid the foundations for how humans have exchanged value for millennia. But perhaps Babylon's greatest contribution wasn't tangible, it was the idea of memory. The Babylonians were obsessed with recording, documenting, preserving. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets have survived, covering everything from grain inventories to philosophical hymns. They believed in the power of writing to outlast death and disaster, and they were right. Their voices still reach us, sometimes clear, sometimes faint, across the span of time. Of course, Babylon was not without flaws. It was a society built on hierarchy, with kings and priests at the top, slaves at the bottom. Wars and conquests defined much of its history, and power struggles often undermined its stability. But even its failings are part of its legacy. To study Babylon is to study both the brilliance and the fragility of human ambition. It shows us how easily empires can rise to dazzling heights and how quickly they can crumble when greed and hubris outpace wisdom. In the end, the Babylonian era is more than a chapter in history books. It's a mirror. It shows us our first steps into law, science, architecture, economics, and storytelling, the very scaffolding of civilization. And it reminds us that even in our skyscrapers and digital archives, we're not so different from the Babylonians pressing marks into clay, hoping their words might outlive them. Because, in a way, they did. And so might we. If Babylon's grandeur could blur the line between fact and legend, what about the very words they carved into clay? Could those silent marks hold even greater secrets than its monuments? The wonders of Babylon. If there's one word that clings to Babylon more tightly than any other, it's wonder. Not just because of what archaeologists can prove, but because of what generations have imagined. Babylon sits in history like a half-remembered dream, real enough to leave ruins in the earth, yet shimmering with myths so extraordinary that even today we're unsure where the truth ends and the legend begins. Let's start with the most famous of them all, the Hanging Gardens. Described by ancient writers as a green paradise floating in the desert, the gardens supposedly rose tier upon tier, bursting with exotic trees and cascading waterfalls. They weren't just flower beds, they were an engineering marvel, irrigated by a system of pulleys and pumps that carried water high into the air. Imagine standing in the hot Mesopotamian sun and suddenly glimpsing lush greenery tumbling down stone terraces. It must have looked like the gods themselves had planted Eden in the middle of Babylon. And yet, here's the catch. Archaeologists have never found definitive evidence that the gardens existed. No remains, no foundation, no inscriptions from Babylon itself. Some historians suggest they may have been confused with a different set of gardens in Nineveh, far to the north. Others argue they did exist, but the evidence was lost beneath layers of river silt and later construction. The truth is tantalizingly out of reach, which is perhaps why the Hanging Gardens endure as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Their beauty lies not only in what they may have been, but in the fact that they might forever remain a mystery. But Babylon's splendor wasn't limited to legends. Some of its wonders are undeniably real. Take the Ishtar Gate, for example. Built by King Nebuchadnezzar II, it was a dazzling entryway into the city, covered in brilliant blue glazed bricks and decorated with golden lions, bulls, and dragons. Walking through it must have felt like passing into another realm where gods and mortals mingled. The gate was so impressive that fragments of it were reconstructed in a Berlin museum, where visitors today can still stand in awe of Babylon's artistry. Then there were the ziggurats, towering, stepped temples that dominated the skyline. The most famous was Etemenanki, dedicated to the god Marduk. According to some scholars, this massive structure may have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. From the ground, its peak seemed to pierce the sky. From the top, the world below must have stretched endlessly, desert and river merging on the horizon. The ziggurat wasn't just architecture, it was theology carved into mud brick. Each layer represented a bridge between earth and heaven, a stairway of clay meant to bring humans closer to the divine. Inside the city, wonder wasn't limited to monuments. Babylon was known for its sprawling palaces, decorated with glazed tiles, lush courtyards, and banquet halls big enough to hold hundreds. Nebuchadnezzar's own palace, according to accounts, had walls so thick and strong they seemed to defy time. Babylon's urban planning was meticulous. Wide streets, marketplaces humming with activity, canals weaving through neighborhoods like lifelines. To live there was to be immersed in a world that was both practical and dazzling. What makes Babylon fascinating, though, is how much of its image is a fusion of fact and imagination. Ancient travelers and later writers often exaggerated what they saw or what they wanted to see. To Greek historians, Babylon wasn't just a city. It was a symbol of opulence, decadence, and almost supernatural grandeur. To biblical writers, it became a metaphor for human pride and downfall. Over centuries, Babylon transformed from bricks and mortar into myth and morality tale. Even today, Babylon lives somewhere between history and story. When we picture it, we don't see a ruined site in Iraq. We see gardens that may never have existed, towers that may have been taller in memory than in reality, gates that shimmered brighter in the mind's eye than under the Mesopotamian sun. That duality is part of its magic. Babylon teaches us that human civilizations don't just leave behind ruins, they leave behind legends. And sometimes, those legends endure longer than stone. So, was Babylon the glittering paradise described in ancient texts? Or was it simply another city of mud brick and ambition? The answer, perhaps, is both. Its tangible remains prove it was powerful and advanced, while the myths woven around it prove it was unforgettable. In the end, Babylon's true wonder might not be a single building or garden. It's the way it has continued to captivate us for nearly 4,000 years, refusing to fade quietly into the past. That's what makes this tablet so powerful. It doesn't just whisper about the past, it seems to echo into our present, almost daring us to pay attention. Why this matters now? It's tempting to treat an ancient tablet as a relic, something to admire in a museum case and then forget. But the words this one carries refuse to sit quietly behind glass. They feel urgent, pressing, almost uncomfortably familiar. And that's what makes this discovery so haunting. It doesn't just belong to Babylon, it belongs to us too. Think about the world the tablet described: cities rising and falling, kings toppled, floods washing away stability, ordinary people forced to wander. Strip away the clay and the cuneiform, and doesn't it sound like the evening news? Climate disasters displacing millions. Governments collapsing under corruption or conflict. Leaders who seem untouchable one moment and powerless the next. The echoes are uncanny. Babylon wasn't the first civilization to wrestle with instability, and it won't be the last. History is full of great empires that believed they'd endure forever until drought, greed, war, or their own arrogance brought them to their knees. The chilling part is how little we seem to learn. The Babylonians wrote it down in clay, warning about cycles of forgetting and suffering, yet here we are, thousands of years later, still stumbling into the same traps. And maybe that's why the timing of this translation feels so striking. It arrives in an era where we pride ourselves on progress, technology, and control. Yet we're as vulnerable as ever to forces bigger than us: economic collapse, shifting climates, political unrest. The tablet's refrain, "The one who forgets will suffer again," lands less like an abstract proverb and more like a mirror held up to our time. Of course, you could dismiss it as coincidence, as human imagination stretching too far. But even if the message was never meant for us, even if it was only written for Babylonian eyes, the effect is undeniable. It makes us stop and reflect. That's the strange power of ancient words. They remind us that the fears we think are unique to our century are anything but. Maybe that's the true gift of this discovery. Not prophecy, no warning, but perspective. The knowledge that civilizations before us faced the same storms we're facing now, and that forgetting their lessons isn't just careless, it's dangerous. AI as the new archaeologist. For centuries, our understanding of ancient civilizations has been limited by what the human eye could decipher and the human hand could restore. Broken tablets, eroded inscriptions, and incomplete manuscripts often left gaping holes in history, holes filled with speculation. Now, artificial intelligence has stepped into the role of a new kind of archaeologist. Unlike traditional methods, AI doesn't just look at what is visible, it predicts what might have once been. Algorithms, can reconstruct missing fragments, compare damaged texts with thousands of others, and even detect subtle patterns invisible to human scholars. Suddenly, tablets once thought too broken to read whispers again. A single recovered line can flip the meaning of a myth, rewrite the story of a king, or reveal that a society was more complex than we imagined. This isn't just about filling in blanks, it's about challenging the very foundations of history. Long-held assumptions about who invented certain sciences, how empires rose and fell, or what ancient people believed may all be overturned. In partnering with AI, we are no longer passive listeners to the past. We are active participants in rewriting it. The clay speaks again, but with a digital translator by its side. We'd love to hear your thoughts, too. Write your comments in the section below and make sure to subscribe to the channel for future uploads.